Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good in between, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still very much wrapped in a pandemic, despite some news these days that is being propagated that we're going to leave the public health emergency in the United States. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's an overheating planet. Record temperatures in India, in Europe, Southern Europe are coming. I've been on the climate beat for 35 years, and guess what? Humans are warming the planet, and it's really hard to stop that. And we are in a planet where there's also an infodemic, depending on your terminology. The World Health Organization calls the disinformation storm an infodemic. So what do we do about that? What do we do particularly about scale? That's the subject today. How do you communicate scale with impact? How do you, as the pandemic toll ticks into the millions here in the United States and globally, vastly more, as climate change poses global scale threats, can journalists, artists, researchers, and citizens do more to move the world from what's the numbing effect, psychic numbing, a term from Paul Slovic and others, of big numbers, to what some behavioral scientists now call an arithmetic of compassion? I'll show that website in a few minutes. I'm Andy Revkin of the Columbia Climate School Initiative on Communication and Sustainability, a longtime journalist as well. And my guests today are Whalen and Jacque Schrag from Axios, which will show some of your work. The artist Suzanne Firstenberg, whose astonishing work in America, the massive white flag memorial on the National Mall, went up for the first time last year and has been sort of reset now that we're at 1 million. And James Hamblin, who writes for the Bulletin platform I write Sustain What For, who's at Yale, a public health focused MD, and a fine writer at The Atlantic and many other places. Great to have you all here. And Federico Vasquez Calero, I think, is in the green room from Mexico City. Federico, I'll bring you in a couple of minutes, and thank you for joining here. Oh, I see you as well. Okay, hold on. There we go.
Yes, hi. How are you? Glad to meet you. A pleasure.
Federico is a political analyst and policy strategist in Mexico City, who's pushing forward with a perception maker and shaper and analyzer. We'll learn a little bit about that in the second half hour. Our Axios friends can't stay on too long because they're getting ready for a retreat, and as always, immersed in nonstop work. But again, thank you. I want to show a couple of things here to begin with. Let me just share my screen. Here's a view. I think this is the million flag installation, Suzanne. Is that correct?
This was the installation of In America Remember, as it was on the National Mall for 17 days last fall.
Oh, this is the older one. All right. I still have that picture seems to be hiding in my computer.
And this is what it looked like from an aerial view.
I'll try to sift for the other one. But in the meantime, let's just start with a brief thumbnail sketch of how you came to this kind of art and what has been the response so far with this particular piece.
Well, planting white flags in honor of those whom we've lost to COVID was just a natural response for me as a visual artist living in the Washington, D.C. area, because the numbers of those who had died from COVID became so large in 2020 that people were ignoring the number. When a number becomes so large as to be difficult to understand, it's too easy to ignore. And so I wanted to create some type of art that would help people really understand the magnitude of our loss. So that is why I did 2 installations. The first was outside of RFK Stadium in Washington, D.C., and that ended in the fall of 2020 at 267,000 flags. That is a picture from fall of 2020. And then people from the National Park Service and from the Trust from the National Mall visited, and they realized that I really needed to bring that art to the greatest stage in America, which is the National Mall. So in the fall of 2021, I brought that at scale to the ground in between the Washington Monument and the Ellipse. And that began at 666,000 flags And when that exhibition closed on October 3rd in 2021, it had 701,000. Making deaths materially understandable was, to me as a visual artist, essential, because it was a one way for people to really understand the magnitude of our loss.
And on the website, at least the Virtual in America website, there's a way to plant your own flags. Is that correct? So it's still, there's an ongoing component here?
The exhibition ended in October. And so people until then could use that website, because equity is important. And we wanted people who didn't have the time or money to come to Washington to be able to plant flags at that time. I am still supporting people if they want to plant or to dedicate flags, because that was such an important part of the In America art. They can contact me at my studio or visit me at my studio, and those flags will go into the permanent archive. I'm also working with the Smithsonian on a traveling exhibition. So flags that are newly added to the archive can be a part of that as well.
That's great. And there's something about that physical experience. I was not there. I haven't traveled. I went to Washington once in the last 2.5 years for a meeting with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, but I have not been there beyond that. But this gets us to the virtual world of Axios, where just to remind folks, today the news this week is that there's pressure at the political federal level to call an end to the public health emergency, and I'll try to get James to weigh in on that in a second. But here's your project, and let's just talk about the realities that we are living dispersed lives, that that the internet, despite the nightmarish aspect of living on a screen, is a way to have some convening and some asynchronous and distributed sense of the same ideas. So maybe Jacque and Jared, first just tell us a little bit about how you became visual journalists as opposed to anything else with the skill sets you have had. What led you into this? And then I'll scroll through this and we can talk about it.
Jared, you want to go first?
Sure. So my entrance into journalism itself is pretty standard. I went to Temple University in their journalism department, and I was mostly doing photojournalism, video journalism at the time. But towards the end of my time at Temple, I got really interested into this idea of data visualization and design. This was a few years after you started really seeing these beautiful long form pieces coming out of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and I was instantly hooked. So I started teaching myself to code. Flash forward a few years, I've been through the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was working with the USA Today local network for a little while, and now I'm at Axios working on the data visualization team. My interest in the data viz type of journalism, it just kind of combines all my favorite things. As a journalist, I love storytelling. I like taking a bunch of different anecdotes and pieces and putting them together. And while I did that with video journalism all the time, with data journalism, it's different. You're taking pieces of raw information that might be hard to digest, hard to understand, hard to access, and just putting it all together in a way that a reader can engage with and hopefully get something out of in a very pleasing way.
And James, let's click back to March. Well, here was April 2nd, 2020, when we were at Galveston death hurricane scale. What was your situation at that time?
April 2nd, 2020. Yeah, I mean, I was expecting this to be a very long road. The people I was speaking to at the time, yeah, I mean, people hesitated to mention any sort of death toll, but just by the calculations of, what we were seeing for fatality rates and how transmissible this was, it was pretty clear it would be in the millions. We were nowhere near, there was not going to be an endpoint. In the foreseeable future. So it was really hard to talk about because everyone there were the most contradictory possible messages coming, especially from Washington, but even from most journalists and doctors are trained to, not, you don't want to make a wild prediction, like millions of people are going to die. So it was just more comfortable to either say everything's fine or stay quiet. So you didn't have a lot of people, I think, appropriately setting expectations of scale.
And at that same time, you had still even contradictory advice on what to do, even if you did engage you. So that made it.
Yeah. People, the really definitive, simple advice floats to the top. People don't really want to hear, like, there were long discussions about the possibility or potential for, airborne transmission, exactly what should be done. But really the old adages of just like, wash your hands, stay apart from people, stay home, were the ones that got repeated, stuck in your minds. And, and that was more definitive. So it was easier for people to say, and we shied away from what was uncertain.
Truly amazing. So Jacque, again, what got you into this form of journalism, again, based on all the variety of things you could be doing?
Sure. So like Jared, I'm also a self-taught web developer. My journey started on the MySpaces and the live journals of the world about 20 years ago. And I have an educational background in history and moved to DC to get my master's degree in international relations. And it was while I was doing my master's degree, I realized that there was a way and a need to pair, topics that I really cared about in this international relations field with technology. And that was a space that was growing. And so my first job out of grad school was working at a think tank here in DC, where I led development for the last 5 years, working on websites and data visualizations and long form stories that were designed to take these kind of public policy recommendations and research that were being done, as part of this think tank, and expanding it to a broader audience outside of the Beltway, outside of, the PDF report that the, people on the Hill would typically read. And in doing that, just like Jared, was being very much exposed to the work that was happening, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these other amazing organizations. And so I was really glad to be able to join Axios and get to do more of that full time myself.
That's pretty great. And the Axios has been really at the foreground of not just innovating in visualizations, but in sort of finding a way to acknowledge complexity, but also distill it. So we were talking about this a few minutes ago before we started, that it seems to be a very unusual shop that way. Not everything is about long and deep. You can have the deep option, but it's an interesting model there.
Yeah, definitely. For those not familiar, Axios has this idea of smart brevity with their storytelling approach. And if you've ever read an Axios story, you'll quickly see what you mean. You're not going to get the 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 word deep dive you might see at more legacy media, whereas Axios is really focused on the commuter, the person who's pulling it up on their phone and reading it in a newsletter, and really trying to break it down into what does the reader need to take away. And what's really interesting for us on the DataViz team is we have that same idea and apply that to visual journalism. What is the most important information? How do we not overwhelm the reader with 1,000 annotations or 1,000 things to look at, and really distill it down and maintain that smart brevity idea?
So I want to broaden out to another example that was early in the pandemic, and also to the international scale, because I think Federico, we'll try to get Federico in on this conversation at that point. I'm going to show something early on. First year, pandemic year one, I did a conversation on what's called terror management theory. It's an arena of scholarship based on how our fear of death, awareness of death, human awareness of death shapes many of our reactions and even our politics and the like. And so I'm just going to show you from a conversation I had with some scholars focused on that, a Chinese piece of art that was it had all these qualities. It was aggregated and individualistic at the same time. Let me just show this. Hopefully this will work. I have the sound off, so you'll just see it. And the artist was Wu Guiyang, And what he did was during lockdown in China, people were posting photographs of themselves in all these different situations, and he combined them into a graphic that here I'm just going to zoom out. You'll see what it looks blurry and inconsequential, but here hopefully you'll see how it works. I think I had this queued up right. Come on. Oh, you know what? I think I screwed up. I had it right, and yeah, okay, there we go. So that's the piece of art. Is 3,000 plus photographs, the individual images that together he built into a mosaic of a very familiar and haunting
Yes.
piece. And I thought it was extraordinary. So we're this gets to this question of variety. I don't know if any of you had seen things early on that moved you or you thought was efficacious. The flatten the curve, there was James and others, you probably remember Thomas Pueo, many others were doing these really interesting, maybe you guys did too, visualizations of flattening the curve that may have actually nudged behavior. I don't know if you recall any examples. First James and then others. And Federico, I'm going to get to you now.
I don't recall specific illustrations of it, but as a concept, it was great because it was not only simple to communicate but it gave people a purpose. Like, what are we trying to do here? Everyone knows that you could see images having watched spread in Italy and other places where hospitals are overflowing, and we don't want that here, and that is our short-term goal. So it became much more difficult to talk about after that because there was not such a clear imperative as there is during any acute crisis, and when you enter into chronic phases of problems, it becomes harder to unify around a specific goal.
And Federico, were you in Mexico City through this whole stretch from the beginning?
Yes. Hello. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for
introduce yourself a little bit. Yeah.
And hi, I'm from Mexico City. I work at PAHO at the WHO. I'm in charge of all the program on perceptions and risk communication here in Mexico during the pandemic. And when I listen to you, and when I see all these reflection, I think it's very, very important. All the kind of illustrations, no? I think these visuals have been very, very important during the pandemic. I think with the image and visualizations, we can talk about some kind of the politics of perceptions, through visualizations, because people think through image, I think people that when you talk about perceptions, we talk about exactly, we talk about some visualizations, but people think through this kind of imaginations, that you can see in the visualization, in image, and this is very, very important, the art also, but all kind of images can be part of the politics of perceptions during the pandemic, and they have been very, very important for all the for trying to influence behaviors or responses or decisions, and I think the visualizations are part also of a battle of imaginations, that we can imagine the pandemic through some ideas, or we can think about it in some way. I think they are very, very, very important, and the pandemic also remind us that we are more like symbolic humans, that we are not also rational human beings. We are also like symbolic and subjective. I think that's very important. And
Yeah, that issue, I've come to grips with this as a journalist, slowly and reluctantly. The fact that it's normal for us to be irrational.
Yes, exactly.
The
I know.
human behavior.
Yeah.
There's a guy at Yale, at the law school, Dan Kahane,
Yes, exactly.
who found through empirical work that more science literacy does not lead to more concern on climate change. Depends on your culture, your politics, your frame of reference. Yeah, and that, when I wrote about that in 2009, the first time, I was like, oh my God. I don't know whether the journalist here or James, as or the artist, Suzanne, when you grapple with the reality that it's normal, and actually, I'll get to the rational part in a second, rational for us to be irrational. How do you kind of stay sane and feel effective? Maybe we'll go around here if anyone feels strongly about that. We'll start with the public health scientist, because you're always working with statistics, telling people to eat something, etc.
Me? Well, I'm more of a journalist than a scientist, but
well, you're an MD.
I could not answer well the question, how do you stay sane or feel effective? Because I'm not sure how well I'm achieving either of those. But I think it helps keep in perspective that we all sometimes make sort of coldly rational decisions, and we all sometimes make purely emotional or gut instinct type decisions. And an example I mentioned in my class is like romance. I mean, we sort of a lot of cultures encourage, if you're in love with someone, it doesn't matter if they live across the country and you have very little in common, and you don't see eye to eye on all kinds of things. If you love each other, go do it. Just got to trust your feelings, and we all make, emotional decisions that were not well researched sometimes, and in other times we are making really analytic decisions. And so you can empathize, I think, with people who just are allocating their certain decision making powers elsewhere, because it's evolutionarily adaptive that we don't spend all our time perseverating over hyper analyzing every single decision. I mean, that we would never get anything done. So that is normal, and I think it does, the visual work is in getting people to kind of apply different frames of decision making than they have previously been, as they reconsider an issue from a new perspective.
And if I could just chime in here, I think that the pandemic really has threatened us at a primal level, and it has hit to our core. We saw it coming. We sat on our couches and just watched as it got closer and closer. And I think irrationality is understandable because there is such a need just to serve our primal selves. And irrationality, in some instances, gave people a feeling of comfort. People, obviously, we've watched this. They've turned to their social circles, their social networks for information and for a feeling of stability and safety. But unfortunately, in way too many of those instances, they were turning to those people within their echo chambers of information. And those echo chambers served them very poorly. So I have to say that it's not just experiencing the input of information through that primal self, but it is also access to information that has gotten us here and that has caused me, last fall to plant so many flags. And that's why I think art is incredibly important, because art can glide in under the doorways, those locked doorways to those echo chambers, or glide in, filter in through those air vents. And public art can approach people from a different perspective. And that's so I always tell people, art in times like these, when people aren't listening or they're only tuning into their own trusted channels, art is no longer an elective. It's got to be an imperative. And coming later this week, I'll be talking with arts administrators from locations across the country and really impressing upon them their role in addressing what's going on.
The arts are not just an adornment.
No.
No. This, other thoughts from the Axios journalists, Jacque and Jared, before you have to go on, what's your mission? Or looking ahead, if you could imagine a graphic that focuses on preparedness, as I know James and we all are thinking about the next pandemic, what does that look like? Maybe
Jacque,
maybe
immediate thoughts.
Oh yeah.
My immediate takeaway would just be that it's hard to tell people what to prepare for, because in the history of people who make predictions, it doesn't usually end well for them. But one thing that I know Jacque and I tried to do in this project is to display the humanity behind a number like this. And whenever you're dealing with something like 1 million deaths, if you everybody's seen line charts, everybody's seen a lot of these common visualizations, which are very effective in conveying one thing. But here we were trying to convey this scale, the emotion of loss here, and how that connects to preparedness. My hope would be that when somebody looks at this, they can, in combination with all the other great resources out there about lessons learned, have that informed decision making, have that inform what do we do next.
And James, again, thinking about your work on communicating public health, you're always thinking about risk reduction going forward, not just chronicling what has happened. So what does success look like? And Federico has some slides that are useful here for this. I might show one or two toward the end.
What does success look like in preparing for future pandemics?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, I think I'm sure there's been good visualizations done that I feel like I've seen a few that sort of chart the courses that would have been different if we had not done or had done, certain things earlier. I heard some statistic about if, everyone had gotten their vaccines as soon as possible and gotten boosted, how different the numbers would be. I think there is a good opportunity right now for revisiting some of those decisions, and not all of them will have borne out to have had a huge impact, or to have been and exploring the other costs, the social costs, economic costs, and helping people to think through, to honestly self-analyze and be critical and be better on the same page. If a new virus arises tomorrow, I think we're just it's hard to imagine what action would be taken at all, because there's already so much division. And so the more we can rebuild social fabric and also redistribute wealth so that people don't have the sorts of disparities that were manifested in who actually became most severely ill and died. I'll stop there.
Yeah, although you got to a really important point, which is one thing I've thought about a lot, and I ran some of these conversations on early on, was the care economy. If people had more of a sense of how fundamental the endurance and resilience of those who are not just doctors, but the maintenance workers in hospitals, the whole ecosystem that supports what we call normal life, then maybe that could spur more support for whether it's alternative minimal income, or the driving through visualization or storytelling the story of the normalcy of having an economy that relies on all that stuff we don't think about. Feels like something to bring to the foreground, but it's hard. That's a hard one. And I know it's 1:30, so Jared and Jacque, are you? Jacque, do you have a last thought? Are you girding for your next assignment related to these tough issues?
Yeah, I mean, there's the thing about working in journalism, right? Is as soon as you publish one piece, you immediately have to turn to the next big thing. Yeah, and how you visualize preparedness is honestly a question I don't answer, which is why I pushed it to Jared. I think at this point, the best that we can do and what our team tries to do is we try to report things as factually as we can and objectively as we can. 2 years into this pandemic, we now have 2 years worth of data that we can look at. So we can look at, where vaccine rates were higher, and, look at deaths comparatively and kind of see like what were the trends, what were there, and use that information to try and, to convince people who maybe haven't gotten their vaccines yet, okay, you are more at risk because of this, and here's the data that shows that. At the end of the day, people are going to make their decisions rationally or irrationally, however they need to in that moment. And I think our job is just to try and give them that information and try and underline where we can, here's a direction that you should maybe really consider if you hadn't before. But it's hard.
Yeah, it's definitely hard in newsrooms because we end up, I just did a conversation on Friday with Seth Bornstein from the Associated Press, a couple other journalists about the challenge of reporting on the non-data driven realities around issues like climate and COVID. We either side with anecdote or we underplay research that is scholarly but not data-based. And this foresight thing I've dealt with forever. In 1996, I wrote a major takeout on the future of the New York City water supply, like 5,000 words, on all the cumulative risks around these reservoirs scattered over 2,000 square miles upstate New York. And Princess Diana died like just before, or the day that was scheduled to post, and it ended up greatly shrinking. And also an editor, even before that, she said, isn't this a little bit ahead of the news? Just shoot me now. Like, yeah. And that's driven me crazy ever since in covering these big momentous issues, the not getting ahead of the news. So and by the way, this also gets to one last thing, which is the limits of the role of journalism. Back to what Federico has worked on is, can we use social media, or can institutions outside of journalism play a bigger role here too? And could you just talk about your perception?
Yes, I can. I want to say like 2 or 3 things very shortly. For example, what Suzanne said is very important. I think that if we want to be better prepared for the next emergency. No, we have to integrate like culture in risk communication. No, I think that is very important to integrate like cultural strategies to communicate risk, to communicate data, because one of the main lessons is that facts don't match the perceptions. No, I think we have to remember that. No, that we can have greater evidence. We can have all the facts, all the numbers, but one of the main lessons is that facts don't move souls. No, it's like, okay, that's it. No, I think what is one of the main lessons of the pandemic. And we need to use culture to communicate in very, very creative ways, and that's a role also for journalism. No, yes,
yeah.
I think that's some issue, and the other big one is that we have to think more politically on perceptions. I think we need not also to think like the political determinants of perceptions, but also to think politically. Who decides, who builds the story, the narrative. And we have a lot of examples that we can use to think politically about perceptions. And that's it. The thing, like, we can stop there, but
but that's
a very important issue. It's
those extra contexts are so interesting. There's a scientist at Columbia University, a climate scientist, whose name I can't remember at the time. He just told me in his town, he joined the Climate Action Committee, what can we do for energy efficiency, etc.
Okay.
And he thought he was being very clever. On the website, he put in this graphic that you may have seen. It's this warming stripes. It's 150 years of temperature. It's like cool colors going to warm colors. It's red, blue, 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 and then it gets hotter, hotter, hotter. So he put that on the banner of the website, and he got some very angry reactions because red and blue in America is about politics.
Yeah.
And he was thinking climate, but he actually caused some division because people interpreted it as being about politics.
Exactly. Red, blue, conservative, Democrats.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the context
Yeah, I
can
know.
matter enormously.
Okay.
And I'm sure there's probably been a graphic you guys at Axios have worked on that has that kind of where the reaction might not be what you expect. I don't know if that's happened before. But
It happens a lot.
you think, oh,
That's to be expected. I mean, people bring their own backgrounds and own context to everything that they look at, right? And visuals mean that all the time. We have style guides in place to try and address some of these things. Like we try and avoid using red and blue on charts when possible, unless there is a political connotation, because it's so ingrained in our audience. Blue diamonds, red diamonds were out of the question immediately when we were coming up with the color palette for this piece, just to try and avoid any of that. So we went for a nice neutral purple.
I want to show one thing that I think takes us into that realm of solutions graphics. Let me see if I can get this up. In Canada, there's an experiment underway. It's only in about 4 or 5 cities. It's this myheat.ca is the website. And it's a visualization of energy loss from homes, where if you don't have good insulation, your house glows in infrared wavelengths, and solar adoption. And so it creates kind of a community awareness of who has solar panels and who doesn't. It's really not political. It's just sort of facts. And it's the project involves Google. I think they're helping with the infrastructure, capture more energy savings and drive energy. So it's trying to build this sort of community awareness and, a portal then to pursue a solution. This is not necessarily highly germane to pandemic risk, but it feels like a frontier to me as a way to think about graphics where you're creating kind of a portal and a agency as much as telling a story. And this is again, data showing house efficiency, energy impact. Of course, you want to know what's data, how do we know it's reliable and the like, and you can go to the website to learn more. But it sort of creates a picture that's different than the picture of a community you would otherwise have. And I think, to me, it feels like a frontier. So, and it is journalistic. I mean, this is not a journalism project. It's an open project, but I could see, this reminds me of what the Atlantic did with COVID-19 tracker. What a different way of thinking about journalism.
Yeah. I mean, for all the people out there who I think are really helped by really, compelling graphics, images that can distill a complex topic into something memorable. There are also a lot of people out there who are wanting to, do your own research, but in an honest way, and prefer the just show me as a ton of stuff and let me explore for myself and figure it out. And I think we should be thinking about both sorts of learning and decision-making styles.
Yeah, I think that gets to the range of art too. Suzanne, there's an artist, I don't know if you've ever heard her work or seen her work, named Stacy Levy in Pennsylvania, who has done these works. I probably can't pull one up efficiently, that were inspired by the spiral jetty in the Great Salt Lake, which is this famous 1970 piece of monumental art created with big bulldozers. And she creates spiral wetlands. So the art is actually remediating the ponds that she builds them in. It's active art that's actively sucking excess nutrients out of a pond. So that's at one end. And then there's those photographs of people assembled into the Munch nightmare.
Yeah, into Edvard Munch's The Scream. I have to admit that at the beginning of the pandemic, I took that same image and I recreated it, don't tell anyone, out of Donald Trump quotations.
I don't think, I think you're telling some people right now.
But I one of the things that I want to do with art that I think could be helpful in preparedness is working to reframe people's perceptions about our politics. In The Atlantic, there was a brilliant article by Jonathan Haidt, I think April 11th, I believe. And in it, he explains how, while we have this concept that it's red versus blue, only 6% of Republicans are truly strong, hardcore, devoted conservatives, and only 8% of Democrats are truly progressive liberals who would not compromise. But that leaves a lot of room in the middle for purple. That leaves a lot of room for compromise. And if people, I will find a way to use art to help people reconceptualize politics, because that's the first step, to me, in my thinking, to reorganize our system.
Federico, that sounds like it resonates a little bit with your thinking too.
Yeah, sure, totally. Yeah, I think that art and culture have to be part of the strategies for emergency preparedness. No? If you go and talk with public health officials, they are gonna be like, what? How are we gonna integrate this? But I can say you that in my experience during these 2 years, with art and culture, you can make more in risk communication or for managing some perceptions, like in tough places like this image, that you have a lot of slums there, a lot of tough places, but also in a health emergency, you can communicate with, or you can touch the soul. It's very like existentialist, but it's not. You can touch the feelings of people with art and with culture. It's very important. They have to be part of communication strategies, I think, and people think a lot through these kind of images, they feel you can feel like stress, or you can feel anxiety through these kind of images,
Yeah.
And if you want to transmit a message of calm, don't panic, or not be alert, the opposite, you can use a lot of culture and artist strategies. It's very important to integrate this in preparedness.
So this is very helpful. I guess to me, one of the lessons over and over again is crosstalk is really valuable. Just what we're doing today, not just sort of telling a story of a particular project, but thinking, well, who could help enrich or iterate toward more impact? What are the lessons we learned doing Project X? How do we measure impact at these scales? It's a bit of a morass. And how do we? So much of what we're talking about today is about taking lessons from the past and seeing if we can do a little bit better in the future. Building forward better, to me, would have been a much better slogan for the Biden administration than build back better, which implies taking us back to norms and strategies and institutions that we know don't work really well. But build forward better implies frontier, implies uncertainty. And I think we have to embrace that to some extent. We're toward the end here. I know everyone's got a busy week ahead, and I would love any last thoughts from you on, who would you want to have in conversation if we replicated this in a few months, and what would make your work better? I think Jacque and Jared, I'd love to introduce you to Stephen Strader and Walker Ashley, who did this expanding bullseye, data-driven geographic work on, mostly on risks like tornadoes and fires, not so much pandemics, but they're geographers who are just amazing at visualizing risk. And the arts, I think, can play a more direct role in how some newsrooms play out too. Did a discussion early on. Well, I won't pull back. There was a Al Jazeera did a visualization of another emergency room doctor's experience really early in the pandemic. That was amazing. It was like a graphic novel version of his tweet string, and that was incredible. So just what would be a next step? There are people, I know 5 or 6 people I could have added to this conversation myself already in different fields. Any thoughts? Or maybe we'll just, we could all just sort of agree. Sorry.
I mean, I think something that's coming through here, I think specificity is really important, and you get that in a lot of the images, in a lot, the art, in the depictions that you're describing. And when you take these huge complex issues, like climate change, like pandemic preparedness, like abortion, the forest rate, or like gun control, to the point about like Hate's article, when you get granular, there's a lot of agreement on specific things. And where you see the polarization is when you just force people into, wait, are you pro or anti? And then that becomes their lens through which they later answer those questions. So the more we can avoid that and actually straight up just come to people with more specific issues, should abortion happen? Should doctors and patients be allowed to perform abortions under these circumstances? And you'll see like tons of people agree on that, or, the more you can actually have meaningful discussion and help people clarify their own thoughts, instead of falling back on like well, I'm against abortion, so I'll say no to that.
Yeah. That's so true. There is one exercise I'm doing, just so you all know. I just posted on this last week. I'm developing it's not a dictionary. It's a conversation space for words that are problematic, that are misinterpreted, that have multiple meanings. And I call them watchwords. And the first one was just the word we. Like, we need to wash our hands. and what I'm trying to get people to do is pull back from certain words or recognize them and say, well, who is the we in your sentence? And to make it a conversation around words.
So what you're trying to do is work against otherness, because we've become a nation that defines each other by being us versus other.
Yeah, I think for sure. And then just making sure, if you're going to have an argument, let's have clarity on the words. And there are many, many, many. The ones here, energy transition. We're not actually, so far, we're not in an energy transition. We're in an energy addition. We've been adding kinds of energy. We haven't taken away the fossil stuff. So as soon as you start to have a conversation about these terms, then you can start to engage with people on what they mean. And you don't have to adopt their meaning. Well, like with abortion, think about all the different terminology around abortion, pro-life, anti. And if we can find just some way to start with the basics, well, we all value life. That issue is so toxified. I'm not sure there's any way forward that's productive, but it's a way of starting with these things and pulling back to examine your own predispositions, your own sensibilities, and then maybe going forward with a little more.
I feel like that's a great place where this sort of creativity is so needed, because people do need a reframe. They need to step back and have their perspective reframed. Like, journalists are either under-resourced or lazy often in our storytelling, and the good versus evil, us versus them, both sides, people think this, other people think this, they disagree, is just like the default, but it's almost never actually the case. And artists and fiction writers and good storytellers know that that's not the arc of a compelling story. In real art. So I'm trying to think about that better now. I appreciate y'all's work.
I want to do some art that helps people change their self-identity and eliminates or works to eliminate ideology as an identity.
I'd love to have you back on to explore that.
One quick thing, right before we shut down for the pandemic, I just finished a 7-installation art series about drug addiction. And in one of those pieces, it's a 7 TVs, 6 TVs linked together. And it explores the concept that we're all addicted in a way to something. And I'm going to be adding an addiction to that, and it's going to be the addiction to ideology. Because I think at the extremes, what we have found is that when people encounter information that supports their ideologic beliefs, it does trigger a dopamine surge in the brain. And over, this retrains the brain. It changes those synaptic pathways. And so at the extremes, people likely are truly addicted to their ideologies. And if you tell people that, at first they go, oh my God, am I addicted? But I think it gives us a framework to, as you're talking about, Andy, to move forward. Because if we can frame what's happening so caustically with politics, it can help us know what to do. And for instance, with the framework of ideology, that puts the people who truly, with malicious intent, spread disinformation, they're the drug dealers.
Totally. And although I will say sometimes the media fall into the trap of amplifying the edges, just as James was saying, if your goal is clicks, or on TV, cable viewers, you are the drug dealer. And somehow that's one of the tensions in modern newsrooms. I think that's been amplified in the age of the internet, and it's really a tough challenge still. This has been a great conversation. I think we'll call it right now, because again, it's a Monday. Fridays and Mondays suck. I don't know about for you. There's so much to do. And thank you for spending some time here today. And especially Jacque and Jared, you're diving into a rare retreat with your staff. Take advantage of that. Maybe bring some of the lessons from insights from today's conversation into that at Axios. That'd be cool. And we definitely should do a webcast going forward on fostering regional journalism, like we were talking about at the beginning. So thanks for being here today, all of you. Anyone who's watching, as soon as this is archived, you can look back at the links. The little scrolling thing at the bottom that's trying to get your attention actually has some useful ways to get in touch. I know someone was looking to get in touch with Suzanne, so I can follow up with that. And share this when we're done. This gets archived right away on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. Again, thank you. This is a Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast. You can keep track by subscribing to my feed also below. Thanks, Federico, James, Jared, Jacque, and Suzanne for being here. And go forth and multiply these experiments. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.